soul into the strings, a quiet boy in a loud world, his violin the only voice that truly spoke his truth. But when the new principal heard his music, he didn't hear art, he heard noise, a disruption to his carefully ordered, prejudiced world. He tried to silence the boy, to break his spirit. He never imagined that same noise would soon bring an entire school to its knees, weeping for the beauty he tried to crush. Welcome, friends, to a story that will resonate deep within your heart. What you're about to experience isn't just a tale of talent unrecognized, but a powerful look at courage in the face of casual cruelty, and the incredible strength found in authentic self-expression. We're so glad you've joined us. If stories that challenge, inspire, and move you are what you seek, consider becoming part of our community by subscribing and hitting that notification bell. We believe in sharing voices that demand to be heard every single day. Thank you for being here. Now let the music begin. The worn brick walls of Northwood High School stood as a stoic sentinel in a city that often chose to forget the stories held within such institutions. Generations had passed through its imposing oak doors, each leaving an indelible mark, a whisper of youthful dreams, heartbreaks, and the quiet, persistent hum of ambition. Yet, amidst the cacophony of teenage life, the clatter of lockers, the murmur of gossip in crowded hallways, the rhythmic thud of basketballs in the gymnasium, few sounds had ever graced its aging auditorium with the kind of raw, untamed beauty that flowed from Jamal Washington's violin. At 17, Jamal was a study in quiet contradictions. To his peers, he was largely an enigma, a lanky silhouette often seen navigating the boisterous corridors with an almost spectral grace. His dark, thoughtful eyes, usually downcast, seemed to absorb the world around him without directly engaging it. He was the boy hunched over a worn music theory textbook in the corner of the library during lunch, the one whose fingers tapped out silent concertos on his desk. During history class, his mind clearly orchestrating symphonies far removed from discussions of Civil War battles or Reconstruction politics. He lived with his grandmother, Jamal Washington, in a small, meticulously kept clapboard house on the south side of town, a neighborhood euphemistically referred to as across the tracks. It was a part of the city where the azaleas bloomed just as brightly, but where municipal funding for sidewalks and streetlights seemed to perennially run dry, a subtle cartography of neglect. Jamal's world, his truest home, was music. It had been his compass and his confidant since the age of 7. He remembered the day vividly, a sweltering summer afternoon, the air thick with the scent of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. He and Alara had been walking past a dusty downtown square when the sound first reached him, the plaintive, soaring notes of a violin played by a street musician, a man with eyes as old as the sorrowful melodies he conjured. Jamal had stopped, transfixed, the cacophony of the city fading into a reverent hush around that singular, captivating sound. Alara, a woman whose own voice, once a celebrated alto in the church choir, had softened with age but never lost its capacity for deep empathy, saw the profound hunger in her grandson's eyes. It was a longing that transcended mere childish curiosity. It was the look of a soul recognizing its native tongue. With sacrifices she never spoke of, Alara managed to acquire a battered second-hand violin from a pawn shop. Its varnish cracked and its strings frayed. To Jamal, it was the most beautiful object he had ever seen. Under Alara's patient, if untutored encouragement, and with the aid of a few tattered instruction books rescued from a library discard pile, he began to teach himself. The violin wasn't just an instrument, it was a key, unlocking a universe of feeling he couldn't otherwise articulate. It became the conduit for the complex symphony of his young life, the lingering ache for a father who was only a faded photograph, and a collection of stories. The fierce, protective love for his grandmother, who worked 2 cleaning jobs to keep them afloat. The daily accumulation of subtle and not-so-subtle slights he endured as a young black man navigating a world that often seemed determined to misunderstand him, to confine him, to judge him before he'd even spoken a word or played a note. His talent was undeniable, a prodigious, almost unnerving genius that seemed to spring from a wellspring of emotion and intuition far deeper than his years. He absorbed musical knowledge like a sponge, his fingers long and surprisingly strong, finding their way across the strings with a dexterity that was both natural and painstakingly honed. He could coax sounds from the aged wood of his violin that were by turns achingly melancholic, fiercely defiant, or breathtakingly tender. He devoured the classical masters, Bach, Mozart, Vivaldi, their intricate structures and soaring melodies, providing a framework for his burgeoning skill. His renditions were technically precise, imbued with a mature understanding that belied his lack of formal, expensive training. But it was in his improvisations that Jamal's true, incandescent voice emerged. He would take a familiar classical theme, a Bach partita perhaps, and begin to gently deconstruct it, his bow weaving new threads of melody, introducing unexpected harmonies, a subtle shift in rhythm that hinted at something more. Then, seamlessly, he would transition, the structured elegance giving way to the raw, gut-wrenching cry of a Delta blues riff, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of generations of sorrow and resilience. From there, he might soar into an original melody, a composition born in the moment, yet feeling as ancient and inevitable as the turning of the seasons. This was his sound, uniquely his own, a fearless fusion of his heritage and his heart, a musical language that spoke of a lived experience far richer and more complex than his quiet demeanor might suggest. Within the often indifferent, bureaucratically driven confines of Northwood High, Jamal had found one true champion, Ms. Anya Evans, the school's music teacher. A woman in her late 40s with kind eyes that had seen their share of both artistic triumph and crushing disappointment, Ms. Evans was a lifeline for students like Jamal. She had once graced concert halls as a promising concert violinist herself, her future seemingly limitless before the relentless pressure of the professional circuit and a quiet, gnawing burnout had led her to seek a different kind of fulfillment in teaching. In Jamal, she recognized not just talent, but a spark of the divine, a musicality so profound, so intuitive, it made her own heart ache with a mixture of awe and a protective trepidation. She knew with a certainty that chilled her the brutally difficult path that lay ahead for a young black man like him in the fiercely competitive, often insular and exclusionary world of classical and professional music. Ms. Evans did what she could. She gave him extra lessons after school, often in the quiet sanctuary of the otherwise deserted music room. She'd lend him her own prized violin, a beautiful resonant instrument from her concert days, and watch, mesmerized, as Jamal made it sing in ways she herself had only dreamed of. She pushed him, gently but firmly, to hone his technique, to understand the theory, but most importantly, to trust his own unique voice. "Don't let them sand down your edges, Jamal," she'd often tell him, her voice laced with a fierce affection. "Your edges are where the real music lives." The annual Northwood High School Talent Showcase was, for most students, a lighthearted affair, an opportunity to sing slightly off-key pop songs, perform endearingly awkward skits, or juggle with varying degrees of success. It was a night of communal fun, a brief respite from the pressures of academics and adolescence. But for Jamal Washington, it was everything. The grand prize was the newly instituted Harrison Merit Scholarship, named after the school's new principal, a full-ride scholarship to the State University's prestigious music program. It was, in Jamal's mind, his only conceivable path to higher education, his only chance to escape the cycle of limited opportunities that seemed to define his neighborhood, his only hope for a life dedicated to the art form that was his very breath. He practiced for the showcase with a relentless, almost feverish intensity. The small bedroom he shared with stacks of his grandmother's quilting projects was filled with the soaring, sometimes sorrowful notes of his violin until the early hours of the morning. Alara would often sit in her rocking chair in the adjacent living room, her mending forgotten in her lap, a soft smile playing on her lips as she listened to her grandson wrestle beauty from the silence. He was crafting a piece specifically for the showcase, a composition that was quintessentially him. It would begin with a technically demanding, impeccably executed classical etude, designed to showcase his mastery of form and technique. Then, at a precisely chosen moment, it would slowly, almost imperceptibly, morph. The rigid structure would begin to fray, to soften, giving way to one of his signature blues-infused improvisations, a raw, emotional journey from disciplined control to untamed, heartfelt expression. It was a gamble, he knew. It defied easy categorization, but it was the only way he could be truly, authentically himself on that stage. It was his story, told in notes instead of words. Northwood High, however, was in the midst of its own challenging transition. The previous principal, Mr. Abernathy, a kindly, avuncular man who seemed to know every student by name and often greeted them with a warm smile and a corny joke, had retired at the end of the last academic year. His replacement was Mr. Alistair Harrison, a man whose reputation, polished and imposing, preceded him. Harrison was an import, a career administrator who had built his name in more affluent, predominantly white school districts known for their high test scores and rigid adherence to traditional educational models. He arrived at Northwood with a clear, publicly stated mandate from a faction of the school board to raise standards, restore order, and enhance the school's academic profile. These were buzzwords, of course, administrative euphemisms that often translated in practice into a stricter, less tolerant, and more culturally monolithic environment, particularly for students who didn't fit neatly into his narrow definition of excellence or promise. Mr. Harrison was a man of impeccably polished surfaces and deeply ingrained, if often unspoken, prejudices. He favored starched white collars, a firm, almost crushing handshake, and the kind of unshakable self-assurance that often accompanies a lifetime of unexamined privilege and a career spent navigating systems designed to reward conformity. He believed fervently in rules, in established hierarchies, and in a very specific, very Eurocentric vision of what constituted culture, art, and achievement. He had little patience for deviation from these norms, and even less, as events would soon tragically demonstrate, for the raw, unfiltered, and culturally rich expressions of students like Jamal Washington. His smile rarely reached his cold, appraising eyes, and his pronouncements on school policy were delivered with an air of unassailable authority that brooked no dissent. He had already made several pointed public remarks about the questionable allocation of resources to the arts program, particularly for what he termed non-traditional or less academically rigorous musical pursuits, a thinly veiled critique that Ms. Evans had immediately recognized as a threat to students like Jamal. The fateful incident, the one that would set in motion a chain of events no one could have predicted, occurred during a sparsely attended after-school rehearsal in the cavernous, slightly dusty Northwood High auditorium, a mere week before the talent show. Jamal, lost in the intricate emotional landscape of his music, was working through the crucial transition in his piece, That delicate, pivotal moment where the precise, almost mathematical beauty of the classical etude he had chosen began to fray, to crack open, giving way to a deeply emotive, bluesy lament that was pure, unadulterated Jamal. His eyes were closed, his body swaying almost imperceptibly with the rhythm, the violin tucked snugly under his chin, an extension of his very soul. He was so immersed in the sound, in the feeling, that he was utterly unaware of the heavy, creaking sound of the auditorium's side door opening, or of the imposing, impeccably dressed figure of Principal Alistair Harrison striding down the center aisle, his face a carefully composed mask of stern, impatient disapproval. Ms. Evans, who had been listening from the shadowy wings of the stage with a small, proud smile gracing her lips, saw him first. Her smile faltered, replaced by a sudden knot of anxiety in her stomach. She knew Harrison's reputation for unannounced inspections and his thinly veiled disdain for artistic expressions that didn't align with his classical sensibilities. She'd hoped to shield Jamal from his direct scrutiny for as long as possible. Harrison stopped a few feet from the edge of the stage, his arms crossed, his polished shoes gleaming faintly in the dim work lights. His presence radiated a chilling disapproval that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. Jamal, still lost in the passionate crescendo of his improvisation, his bow a blur across the strings, didn't notice him until the final mournful note of his blues lament faded into the vast, echoing emptiness of the auditorium. He opened his eyes, his chest heaving slightly, a sheen of sweat on his brow, the lingering resonance of the music still hanging palpably in the air around him like a dissipating dream. And then he saw him, Principal Harrison, staring up at him from the foot of the stage with an expression that could curdle milk. "Mr. Washington, is it?" Harrison's voice, when it came, was as cold and clipped as a winter wind, devoid of any discernible warmth or even basic courtesy. Jamal swallowed hard, the magic of the music, the sense of transcendence, dissipating like smoke in a harsh draft. He felt suddenly small, exposed, his confidence shrinking rapidly under the principal's icy, appraising gaze. "Yes, sir, Jamal Washington." "And what, pray tell, was that?" Harrison gestured dismissively with a flick of his wrist towards Jamal and his violin, as if indicating something distasteful, something slightly offensive he'd found on the sole of his expensive shoe. The casual cruelty of the question, the deliberate demeaning of his art, struck Jamal like a physical blow. That was my piece for the talent show, sir," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper, the violin suddenly feeling heavy and awkward in his hand. He could feel a flush eolgul kugi. Harrison let out a short, derisive laugh, a sound that held no humor, only scorn. "Piece? Mr. Washington, that sounded less like a musical piece and more like undisciplined noise. A rather jarring and, frankly, inappropriate display for an institution of this caliber, wouldn't you agree?" "Undisciplined noise." The words, uttered with such casual disdain, seemed to echo in the cavernous space, each syllable a fresh wound. "Inappropriate." Ms. Evans, her face flushed with a sudden, fierce anger, stepped forward from the wings, her own composure momentarily forgotten. "Principal Harrison," she interjected, her voice trembling slightly but firm, "Jamal is an exceptionally talented musician. His interpretation is unique, yes, but it is also deeply moving and technically brilliant. He has worked incredibly hard on this piece." Harrison turned his cold, dismissive eyes on Ms. Evans, a silent, withering rebuke that made her momentarily falter, though she held his gaze. "Ms. Evans," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "while I appreciate your, shall we say, enthusiasm for your students, Northwood High prides itself on maintaining certain demonstrable standards of artistic excellence. The Harrison Merit Scholarship, as you well know, is intended for students who demonstrate exceptional promise in established, recognized artistic traditions, not for this sort of self-indulgent cacophony. He turned his attention back to Jamal, his voice hardening, the earlier pretense of civility now completely gone. "Frankly, son," he said, the diminutive term another calculated insult, "I'm not at all sure this kind of performance is suitable for our showcase. Perhaps it would be best for all concerned if you were to reconsider your participation. We wouldn't want to embarrass the school or, indeed, yourself." The implication was brutally clear. He wasn't just criticizing, he was actively threatening, using the full weight of his authority to try and exclude Jamal, to silence a voice that didn't conform to his narrow, prejudiced worldview. Jamal stood frozen on the stage, the violin feeling like lead in his hand. The principal's words, undisciplined noise, self-indulgent cacophony, embarrassed the school, reverberated in his ears, a cruel, unmerited dismissal of everything he was, everything he poured into his music. The carefully constructed world of notes and melodies that had always been his refuge, his sanctuary, felt suddenly fragile, vulnerable, shattered by the casual bigotry of a man who held his future, his one slim hope for the scholarship, in his powerful hands. Ms. Evans tried to protest further, to argue for Jamal's talent, for the validity of his artistic expression, but Harrison cut her off with a sharp, impatient, dismissive wave of his hand. He turned on his heel and strode out of the auditorium, leaving a stunned, humiliated Jamal and an incensed, heartsick music teacher in his wake. The heavy auditorium door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing the finality of his judgment. The air in the auditorium, once vibrant with the passionate strains of Jamal's music, now hung heavy, cold, and thick with unspoken pain. Ms. Evans rushed to Jamal's side on the stage, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears of anger and profound frustration. She placed a comforting hand on his slumped shoulder. "Don't you listen to a word he said, Jamal," she said, her voice fierce, a protective lioness defending her cub. "He doesn't understand. He doesn't want to understand. Your music is beautiful. It's important. It's you." But Jamal could barely hear her words through the roaring in his ears. The principal's pronouncements had lodged themselves deep in his heart, a shard of ice, numbing his spirit. Undisciplined noise. Was that truly all he was capable of producing? Was his unique blend of classical precision and soulful blues, the very essence of his artistic identity, just an embarrassment to be hidden away? The scholarship, his one tangible chance at a different future, seemed to be dissolving before his very eyes, not because he lacked talent, not because he hadn't worked hard enough, but because he was different, because his art didn't fit into a neat, pre-approved, culturally sanitized box. He mumbled a barely audible thank you to Ms. Evans, his gaze fixed on the floor. He quickly, almost furtively, packed his violin into its worn case, the familiar feel of the aged wood and plush lining suddenly alien, almost repellent in his hands. He fled the auditorium, the vast, empty space now feeling like a mausoleum for his aspirations, its silence a mocking counterpoint to the music he had so recently brought to life there. As he walked home through the fading afternoon light, the familiar streets of his neighborhood, usually a source of comfort, seemed to mock him with their everyday indifference. The weight of Principal Harrison's disdain was a heavy, suffocating cloak, pressing down on his shoulders, crushing his spirit. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Jamal Washington didn't feel like playing his violin. The music inside him, his most precious possession, had gone terrifyingly, achingly silent. Unbeknownst to Principal Harrison, however, His act of casual, dismissive cruelty had not gone entirely unnoticed or unrecorded. Maya Rodriguez, a bright, outspoken, and fiercely independent senior, was the energetic force behind Northwood High's surprisingly popular and often controversial student-run news blog, The Northwood Nudge. Maya had a nose for news, a passion for social justice, and a healthy skepticism for authority figures who seemed to wield their power without accountability. That afternoon she had been in the auditorium's cramped lighting and sound booth, tucked away high above the seats, diligently working on lighting cues for an upcoming student drama production. She had heard every word of Harrison's condescending, demeaning tirade against Jamal. Maya, a keen observer of Northwood's subtle and not-so-subtle social and political currents, had already had her suspicions about the new principal. His polished rhetoric about raising standards and restoring order often seemed to translate into policies and attitudes that disproportionately affected students of color and those from less affluent backgrounds. Harrison's targeted attack on Jamal Washington, a quiet, unassuming student known to many only for his incredible, almost otherworldly musical talent, confirmed her worst fears. This wasn't about standards. This was about prejudice and the abuse of power. Her fingers flew across the keyboard of her phone, not to tweet or post, not yet. She needed more information, more context, but to make a detailed note in her secure digital journal, a digital pin in a map of injustice she was slowly, painstakingly charting within the walls of Northwood High. Jamal W., violin. Harrison, public humiliation. Undisciplined noise. Clear attempt to exclude from talent show. Investigate further. Potential racial, class bias. This, Maya sensed, was more than just a mean-spirited comment from an out-of-touch administrator. This felt like a targeted act of cultural and artistic suppression. Ms. Evans, meanwhile, was not one to be easily cowed or defeated, especially when one of her students, one of her most promising and vulnerable students, was under attack. The fire in her own artistic soul, long dormant under layers of pedagogical routine and bureaucratic frustration, had been rekindled by Jamal's extraordinary talent, and Harrison's blatant attempt to extinguish that bright flame filled her with a protective, righteous fury. She knew the principal held the institutional power, the power to make or break a student's academic and extracurricular life. But she also knew the undeniable power of truth, the compelling power of authentic art, and most crucially, the undeniable, breathtaking power of Jamal's music. That evening, after most of the faculty and students had left the building, Ms. Evans did something she hadn't done in years. She retrieved her old, professional-grade recording equipment from a dusty closet in the back of the music room. A high-quality microphone, a portable digital recorder, items she hadn't used since her own concert days. She carefully set it up in the now empty, acoustically sound music room. She then called Jamal, her voice deliberately gentle but firm, infused with an urgency he couldn't ignore. She asked him, implored him, to come back to the school just for a little while. "Play for me, Jamal," she urged, her voice a soothing balm over his wounded spirit. "Play it all. Not for him, not for the contest, not for anyone but yourself. Play it for Samuel, for your grandmother, for the music itself. Let it out, son. Let it breathe." Hesitantly, reluctantly, Jamal returned to Northwood High. The empty school felt eerie, a stark contrast to its daytime clamor. The music room, smaller and more intimate than the cavernous, now tainted auditorium, felt like a safer space, a sanctuary, with Ms. Evans as his sole, deeply attentive and encouraging audience. He took out his violin. His hands were trembling slightly, his confidence still fragile, but as he tucked the instrument under his chin and drew the bow across the strings, something shifted. The music began to flow. He played the full, uninterrupted piece he had been preparing for the showcase. He began with the technically demanding classical etude, its intricate passages executed with a newfound depth of sorrow, a poignant fragility that hadn't been there before. Then, at that crucial juncture, he allowed the music to transform. The rigid structure of the etude began to soften, to bend, to weep, giving way to his signature improvisation. It was a torrent of raw, visceral emotion. The pain of Harrison's dismissal, the defiant assertion of his own artistic voice, a deep, soulful longing for understanding, and an unshakable, resilient beauty that seemed to transcend the ugliness he had experienced. He played with his eyes closed, his body moving with the music, the violin an extension of his very soul, sobbing, singing, soaring. Miss Evans didn't interrupt, didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. She just listened, tears streaming unheeded down her face as the hidden microphone on her digital recorder faithfully captured every nuance, every subtle shift in dynamics, every breath, every heartbreakingly beautiful, defiant note. When Jamal finally lowered his bow, the last note hanging in the air like a prayer, the silence in the room was profound, almost sacred. Miss Evans quietly stopped the recording, then reached out and gently squeezed Jamal's arm. "That, Jamal," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "was truth, and no one can call truth noise." She saved the digital file, a secret weapon, a powerful testament, a piece of irrefutable evidence. The next few days leading up to the talent show were a blur of acute anxiety and gnawing self-doubt for Jamal. He avoided Principal Harrison and the main school corridors as much as possible, taking refuge in the relative anonymity of the library or the quiet corners of the cafeteria. He practiced his violin, but only half-heartedly. The joy and passion leached from his music by the principal's caustic words. The talent show loomed large, a source of dread rather than anticipation. He seriously considered withdrawing, just as Harrison had so pointedly suggested. What was the point of performing if the man in charge of awarding the scholarship, his only lifeline, had already deemed his art an embarrassment? His grandmother Elara noticed his despondency, the way the light had dimmed in his usually expressive eyes. She tried to comfort him with her quiet wisdom and home-cooked meals, but the shadow of Harrison's judgment was long and cold. But Maya Rodriguez, the intrepid student blogger, had been busy. Her latest post on the Northwood Nudge, carefully worded to avoid actionable accusations, but pointedly direct in its implications, was titled, "Does Excellence at Northwood Now Have a Color and a Class Code? A Question of Artistic Freedom." Without naming Jamal or Harrison directly, the post detailed a deeply concerning incident where a highly talented student artist from a less privileged socio-economic background was allegedly intimidated and discouraged from participating in a major school event due to the unconventional or culturally diverse nature of their artistic expression. The post, shared widely among the Northwood student body via social media and word of mouth, sparked an immediate and intense firestorm of comments, private messages, and heated discussions in the hallways and online forums. Other students, emboldened by Maya's courage, began sharing their own subtle and sometimes not so subtle experiences of feeling marginalized, misunderstood, or unfairly targeted by the new administration's reforms. A Latina student spoke of her carefully researched history project on Chicano activism being dismissed as too political. A group of hip-hop dancers lamented the sudden cancellation of their after-school practice space due to noise complaints that had never been an issue before. A pattern seemed to be emerging, a pattern that suggested Principal Harrison's definition of excellence was indeed uncomfortably narrow and troublingly biased. Ms. Evans, meanwhile, played her own strategic hand. Understanding the power of parental influence, especially within the PTA and the Scholarship Selection Committee, she quietly leaked an anonymized audio clip of Jamal's rehearsal. She chose only the breathtakingly technical classical portion of his piece, the part even Harrison couldn't fault on purely technical grounds. She sent it via a discreet email to a few influential parents she knew, parents who were also on the scholarship committee, with a simple, unassuming note: "Just a brief sample from one of our more dedicated and promising music students. Thought you might enjoy." The hushed whispers began almost immediately. Who was this incredible unknown violinist? The skill was undeniable, the passion palpable even in the brief excerpt. The seed of curiosity and a dawning awareness of a potentially overlooked talent had been planted. The pressure on Principal Harrison was building, an undercurrent of student dissent and parental questioning that, in his insulated office, surrounded by a few sycophantic junior administrators, he failed to fully appreciate or accurately gauge. He still believed he had successfully managed a minor disciplinary issue with a problematic student. He had no idea that the undisciplined noise he had so arrogantly tried to silence was about to become an anthem for a growing chorus of discontent. He was, in his own mind, still firmly in control, still the arbiter of taste and standards at Northwood High. He was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The night of the Northwood High School Talent Showcase arrived, and the old auditorium was buzzing with an electric energy that was more than just the usual pre-show jitters. It was an atmosphere thick with anticipation, with unspoken questions, with a sense of something significant about to unfold. Principal Alistair Harrison sat in the reserved seat in the front row, a patronizing, self-satisfied smile fixed on his face, ready to preside over an evening of what he considered appropriate and uplifting student expression. He'd made a point of personally reviewing the final list of performers with the nervous student council liaison, and was gratified to see that Jamal Washington's name was, as he'd subtly but firmly ensured, through a series of administrative oversights, notably absent. He assumed the boy had wisely taken his fatherly advice and withdrawn. Backstage, however, a quiet, determined rebellion was brewing. Ms. Anya Evans, armed with the full stunning digital recording of Jamal's complete rehearsal piece and a printed copy of the official, time-stamped talent show entry form Jamal had submitted weeks prior, the very form Harrison had conveniently misplaced or overlooked, was engaged in a very firm, very direct, and increasingly heated conversation with the terrified student council president, young Timmy Carlson, and the perpetually flustered faculty advisor for the event, Mr. Henderson, Maya Rodriguez, ever the vigilant journalist, and a small, loyal group of Jamal's supporters, mostly fellow art students who had heard whispers of Harrison's actions, stood by, their phones discreetly ready to record any further injustice.